Hi, I'm Meredith DeVillez, and today we are going to be looking at how people and events and ideas are introduced in nonfiction text. So let's say that you were writing a story about your best friend who's like a great gamer, right? You wouldn't just say, here's Bob, he's great at gaming, he can raid somebody's base in Ark Survival and win events in NBA 2K20. That's not a very good introduction, is it? You wouldn't say, my friend Sue is the next great YouTuber in makeup. Watch her mascara tutorial. No, you're going to give stories, right? We call those anecdotes. You're going to kind of build that knowledge, and that's what we're going to look at today, is how people do that. So, we are going to start with this article from Newsella. So as we're looking at it, I want you to think about what are we introducing, how is it introduced, and how is then that person, idea, or event kind of built upon or developed throughout the reading. So we'll start with this page, and then there's a second page of it. Okay, so in introducing A.V. Shipman, they don't just say he built a website to track the coronavirus, right? So let's look at how they introduced him. So that's what was introduced, right? So A.V. Shipman and his website, that is the person that we're looking at. So how was he introduced? So they used stories, right? They said in third grade he was coding websites with stick figures. In middle school he was coding games, and then developing him further so that we better understand the website and Shipman and how this all came about. They had quotes by him talking about how this was the greatest event of their generation, talked about why it was needed and why he developed it. Talks about how he skis and participates in hackathons, the reasons for the website and motivation, and how it works and how he gets that information. So it wasn't just A.V. Shipman made a website to track coronavirus. We introduced him, and then we developed the story further by adding in background information and making you feel a little bit more like you know enough about this person to maybe share this information with others. So now we are going to look at a video, and then we'll do the same thing with that.
His name was Leonardo da Vinci. He was a painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, and scientist. And he had one of the finest minds of his century. Leonardo was born in 1452 in the town of Vinci in northern Italy. By the age of 15, he had moved with his father to Florence, a city of great culture where the Renaissance was in full bloom. The Renaissance was a revival of art and learning in Europe not seen since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans. It was characterized by a thirst for knowledge of all kinds and a desire to explore the possibilities of human achievement. True to these ideals, Leonardo studied astronomy, anatomy, botany, and geology. Today we know him best as the painter of the Mona Lisa, but he was also an inventor. His notebooks contained plans for hundreds of machines that were far ahead of their time. Ships, planes, and weapons of war dreamed of hundreds of years before science would create the materials necessary to build them. Leonardo opened a studio in Florence in his late 20s. His drawings from this time period include inventions of farm tools, pumps, and weaving machines. He drew amazingly accurate sketches of human body parts and their functions. A left-hander, Leonardo sometimes wrote backwards. This can be read with a mirror. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence for a job with the Duke of Milan. He worked for the Duke for 17 years as an artist and engineer, designing war machines, weapons, and military defenses. He even had an idea for an armored car. 8 men would have fired its cannons and turned cranks to power its wheels. It wasn't until more than 400 years later that the tank became a reality, first appearing in 1916 during World War I. Leonardo was also an architect and an urban planner. When the Duke hired him as an engineer to design buildings, machinery, canals, and forts, Leonardo came up with plans for an ideal city. It would be built on 2 levels, crisscrossed by canals that would provide transportation. Leonardo's greatest dream was for humans to fly. His notebooks are filled with notes and sketches about birds. He drew several designs of man-powered flying machines. A few years ago, scientists brought one of these designs to life. Using lightweight materials that didn't exist in Leonardo's time, they built this glider with wings like those Leonardo envisioned. Another flying machine Leonardo drew looked like this. We know it as the helicopter. Leonardo was aware of the perils of flight, so he also designed a parachute, a cloth-covered tent which would enable a person to fall safely from a great height. Leonardo spent his last 3 years in France, working as chief painter and engineer to King Francis I. He died there in 1519 at the age of 67. At the time of his death, he was famous mostly as an artist. He actually created very few paintings, but nearly all of them are considered masterpieces. Today we understand the full scope of Leonardo's genius. His pursuit of knowledge and an understanding of nature made him the ultimate Renaissance man, a person who excels in many things.
Okay, so what we are being introduced to in this video is Leonardo da Vinci. So how was he introduced? He said, right, they had the picture up of him and she said, his name was Leonardo da Vinci. He was a painter, sculptor, blah, 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 and went on to all the things that he'd done, right? Then, how did she develop him further? So she talked about where he was born, where he moved, what he studied, why he studied, the fact that he was a Renaissance man, and why. We had pictures of his inventions, interesting facts about his inventions. So in these areas, if you wanted to put maybe a bit more detail rather than generalizations or summaries, you could have said, probably not touch the board, would have been your first tip there. But you could have said, let's see if I can annotate as I can. So, helicopter and parachute. Right? The fact that he had few paintings. Pretend like you can read this. But known as an artist. So that's how they developed him further. So now we are going to read another article. This one gets a little tricky, so make sure that you're really thinking about what you're reading here, and then we're going to go through those steps together as to how our person, event, or idea was introduced, what was introduced, how, and how it was further developed. Okay, so at first read, right, you might think that this is introducing that event that it talked about in that first paragraph, right? So that lucky dog rescue event that they had each year. But, I'm going to need to put on my annotate. Really, what this article is talking about is the idea of pet adoptions increasing during this time. So how was it introduced? So they talked about the lucky dog event. And I'll try to stick to print, but can't make any promises. Right? It talked about some of the stay-at-home orders and how people were going to need companionship. Had a quote from a governor about that you can still walk your dog. Which I don't know if you guys have dogs, but I think my dog's ready for us all to go back to work so he can nap through the day. He is pretty sleepy at night. So now, how is it developed further? So it talked about the rapid increase in adoptions. The reason people are adopting because they are at home to help train the dog or cat or rabbit or whatever. It had an example of a college student adopting. And then lastly in there, and it kind of helped develop the reason kind of behind the increase in the stay-at-home, is it talked about the coronavirus and the spread of it and where it started and all of that. So we have one more video, and then we'll do the same thing together.
From the beginning of human history, people have gazed up in wonder at the sky. Filled with curiosity, some people wanted a closer look at what they saw in the heavens. What are those twinkling lights? How big are they? What are they made of? How old are they? How are they moving? There was only so much they could see with the naked eye. But by 1600, a spectacular new tool had been invented, the telescope. Telescopes collect the dim light from distant planets and stars and help astronomers to see them better. Today, NASA's Hubble telescope is hard at work. It orbits the Earth 380 miles from the surface, demonstrating how much telescopes have evolved. These are some of the first telescopes ever built. They are 300 years old and were made by an Italian man who lived in the 1600s, Galileo Galilei. As a young student, Galileo studied math and physics. The ideas he developed in these areas are some of the most important ever. His ideas on how objects fall and on the movement of pendulums influenced how we measure time. But he is best remembered for his work in astronomy, the study of the stars and planets and other objects in space. Galileo did not invent the telescope. That credit goes to a Dutchman named Hans Lippershey. Lippershey's invention was designed to give ships a closer look of the enemy at wartime. Galileo was the first to point the telescope towards the heavens. He first published his findings in a journal called the Starry Messenger. This article is about Galileo's observation of the moon. He stated that the moon was not a smooth sphere, as people thought, but was covered with mountains. And he did not stop there. He went on to look at the largest planet, Jupiter. It was Galileo who realized that there were 4 large moons orbiting the planet. But these ideas were very radical for the time. Galileo went against the church's belief that the Earth was the center of the universe, and he spent the last years of his life in prison as a result of his beliefs. He died in 1642. 350 years later, Pope John Paul finally recognized Galileo's enormous contributions to science and honored Italy's greatest astronomer. Today his name lives on. Italy's first national telescope is called the Galileo. And NASA's first space probe designed to study the planet Jupiter close up was also named in his honor. Galileo turned a weapon of war into an instrument of science. And because of him, today's telescopes can see into the farthest reaches of the universe.
Okay, so in the beginning you probably thought they were going to tell us about telescopes, didn't you? But we were being introduced to Galileo, Galilei. So how was it introduced? So it told us about telescopes. I'm going to say history and uses. And then how is it developed further? So we talked about the fact that, we didn't talk about it, we listened to it. The fact that he did not invent the telescope, right? He just improved it. That he studied astronomy. That he has space shuttles, satellites named after him. We got to see pictures of his notebook and studies. And maybe there's some other things that you can think of that they used to help develop our understanding of Galileo as well. So this is how, or one way to, as you are looking at new people, ideas, or events, to kind of think about and make note of how they're introduced and how they are further developed, or they further your understanding throughout the information. So one thing that I would like you to do, maybe two things. First thing is, if someone were to write an article about you, how would you want them to introduce you? What funny little story or anecdote would you really hope they included? And then what are some things that you would like them to include as they further share information about you? And then also, as you are reading or watching some non-information or non-fiction information, some informational text or videos, think about how those people, events, and ideas are introduced and further developed throughout that information. And then to get credit for this session today, your code word is introduction. Thank you.